Why do motorbikes with similar weight often feel so different to ride? Steering geometry has a lot to do with it, and if you've always wanted to know what's behind it and how the head angle, offset and trail are connected, stick around. Yes, stability and agility are two qualities you'd most like to have together in the two-wheel world. A bike that tips in with almost no effort yet stays stable in every situation. That's the ideal. Unfortunately, one often rules out the other. With different chassis geometries and motorcycle or engine concepts, you can strike a pretty decent balance. And why bring the engine concept into it now? Because the engine, with its high revving internal shafts, which are usually mounted transversely to the direction of travel, generates very strong gyroscopic forces. The crankshaft in particular, as it's typically the heaviest component in the engine and the one spinning the fastest. With modern slim layouts such as V2, V4 or parallel, twin or triple, you massively reduce those gyroscopic forces thanks to a short and therefore light crankshaft. There are also bikes with a longitudinally mounted engine, for example the Boxer in a GS or the 6-cylinder in the Gold Wing, that delivers a noticeably more agile feel without losing stability, because stability primarily comes from the steering geometry. And now let's take a detailed look at how that geometry is put together. Alright, so what exactly is the steering head angle? Let's start right at the beginning, because this one's fairly easy to picture. It's simply the angle of the bike's steering axis, and it's fundamentally a design dimension. In other words, the engineer sets it at the outset when the motorbike is being laid out. In das Nahtzeig, the angle in a defined position relative to the frame. However, how that ends up sitting on the actual machine isn't fixed yet, which is why there's a second measure you need to consider, the steering angle. Compared with the steering angle, the steering head angle is the design value, while the steering angle is the active angle you get in real riding. That, of course, primarily depends on the given steering head angle, but the way you position the chassis via rear ride height and front ride height ultimately gives you the effective steering angle. The next important quantity is the offset. What are we talking about here? It's the distance from the wheel axle to the steering axis. And if the wheel axle sits centrally in the fork, that is centered in the axle clamp at the fork bottom, then it equals the distance from the center line of the fork legs to the steering axis, which is easy to measure at the top yoke and therefore depends on the yoke. We can see that nicely here. We've got a top yoke that's even adjustable for offset. Here are the fork legs, and the distance from the steering axis, dead center, to the center line of the fork legs is what we call the offset. On adjustable yokes, as you can see here, you can change it very neatly by flipping this insert, for example. Now you can see that this distance has clearly been reduced. So offset is a key value for determining the final trail, which is what we're coming to now. And that's hugely decisive for how a motorbike actually rides. We'll now look in detail at how trail is made up. So, what is trail then? Trail is the distance between the point where the steering axis meets the road surface and the tire's contact patch. It results from the head angle, the offset, and also the tire diameter. It's clear that the larger the tire, the more the contact point shifts with the same overall geometry. So that too has a big influence on the amount of trail. Why is trail so important for the riding feel or behavior of a motorbike? Because it determines the self-centering effect of the tire while riding, and therefore stability and agility. The larger the trail, the more stable the bike. The smaller it is, the more agile it becomes. To demonstrate trail properly, I've brought along a little aid in the form of a bicycle, which basically presents the same conditions as on a motorbike. I've put two markings on the lower part of the tire. One marking shows exactly the steering axis in its extension and the rear marking shows the contact area, the tire's contact patch. Let's now look in detail at what trail really is and how it comes about. We've already explained it briefly, but seeing it on a real object helps you understand why trail is responsible for stability. Now, when we turn the handlebars, we're rotating around this axis. And at the back, at the contact point, you can clearly see how, given this axis of rotation, that point starts to swing out. That distance is the so-called trail, from the extension of the steering axis, meeting the ground at the contact area, back to the actual contact point. That's trail. And if we watch what happens when I lift it and turn it around the steering axis, you can clearly see how the rear point traces, so to speak, a circular path. No? Because of that, when we lean the wheel and the asphalt is, so to speak, coming from the front, the pressure created here turns the wheel back into the direction of travel automatically. So it's easy to imagine that the larger the trail, the stronger the self-centering force. That's what so strongly shapes our feel and both the agility and the stability of a bike. Yes, trail can vary, and of course it depends on the type of machine, whether it's a sporty motorbike, a tourer, or even a chopper. On sporty bikes, especially superbikes, it sits at around 100 millimeters. On smaller sporty motorbikes, the 600 class for example, it can move right down towards about 90 millimeters. That's already quite a small amount of trail. On tourers, it's somewhere between 100 and 115 millimeters. And on a chopper, such as a Harley, that trail can reach 170 millimeters and even go beyond, depending on the design. There are a few extreme custom builds you've surely seen with extremely long forks and very shallow fork angles. They naturally run with much larger trail and are therefore only really rideable to a very limited extent. You do, however, need to be careful with conversions. There are quite a few enduros and big enduros that people like to convert from a 19-inch to a 17-inch front wheel because, as we heard earlier, trail doesn't just come from the base geometry but also from the front wheel diameter. That means if I want to change from a 19-inch to a 17-inch front, as many do, the GS is a good example. In some circles, I'm hitting trail twice. First, because the front tire is smaller, trail is reduced straight away. Second, the front is lowered. That gives a steeper head angle and thus another reduction in trail. That can very easily lead to stability issues. So with such a conversion, you need to realign the base geometry to counteract it. Otherwise, you'll run into high-speed stability problems or feedback issues because a certain amount of trail also feeds feedback from the front wheel. Does that mean a bike with long trail is automatically stable? Not necessarily, because stability depends on many things. It does depend on trail, of course, but to a large extent also on the stiffness of the bike. The frame or the swing arm, for example, that inherent stiffness also tells you a lot about the handling, whether it feels very stiff and very stable, or whether the whole thing turns into a very vague, spongy ride. Beyond that, of course, there's also the length of the motorbike, which has a decisive influence on stability, just like the center of gravity position, where the overall bike's center of gravity ends up. Is it very high or very low? Not necessarily, because stability depends on many things. It does depend on trail, of course, but to a large extent also on the stiffness of the bike, the frame or the swing arm, for example. That inherent stiffness also tells you a lot about the handling, whether it feels very stiff and very stable or whether the whole thing turns into a very vague, spongy ride. Beyond that, of course, there's also the length of the motorbike, which has a decisive influence on stability, just like the center of gravity position. Aerodynamics also plays a major role, especially when it comes to how a bike behaves at high speeds. So you can see that in motorbike development, all of these aspects have to be taken into account and then finally tweaked again in road tests. Because even though a lot can be calculated nowadays, a motorbike's actual behavior, given the complexity, can only be determined and finalized through riding tests, where this fine-tuning becomes particularly essential to keep giving the rider the necessary feedback is in racing. Until then, I'll sign off. Thanks for watching. If you feel this explanation helped, leave me a like and I'll see you next time. Cheers and bye.